There's a particular kind of heartbreak that doesn't come from strangers, but from the people you raised, the people you sacrificed for, the people you thought would always make space for you. And one day you realize they don't really ask how you are anymore. They don't listen when you speak. They nod, they scroll, they rush, and you start to feel invisible in a room you built. Not hated, not abandoned, just unimportant. You don't want to complain, you don't want to guilt them. You just wish they could see the version of you that still feels, that still wants to be part of their lives, that still matters. This video is not about blaming them, it's about reclaiming something in you. Because even if they don't see your worth right now, it hasn't gone anywhere. Let's talk about what to do when the children you gave everything to make you feel like nothing. Section 1. The subtle signs of being pushed aside. It's rarely dramatic. They don't shout, they don't slam doors, they just stop calling as much. They start texting more than talking. They say, "We've just been busy," over and over again. At first, you understand. Everyone has a life, children grow up, families evolve, but over time, the space they create becomes a gap, then a wall, then a quiet kind of loneliness that creeps in between the moments. You begin to notice they only call when they need something. They speak more than they listen. They forget to ask how you're really doing. They roll their eyes when you talk about your aches, your memories, your values. You feel dismissed, not because they say it, but because their actions whisper it. And what hurts the most isn't what they say, it's what they don't. They don't say, "I'm glad you called. I've been thinking of you. I remember how much you did for me." Instead, you're met with short answers, with multitasking, with visits that feel rushed. They're scrolling while you speak. They take phone calls during your time together. They say they'll stop by, but they don't. And slowly you begin to pull back. Not because you don't love them, but because rejection, even when silent, starts to echo in your bones. You find yourself telling fewer stories because they don't listen anyway, avoiding phone calls because they always seem busy, lowering your expectations just to avoid being hurt again. This isn't bitterness, this is survival, emotional self-protection. The kind you learned after the 5th, 6th, or 10th time they forgot your birthday, canceled plans, or brushed off your worries. And no one sees this because you still smile. You still ask about them. You still show up to birthdays and holidays with gifts and warm food. But inside, you're grieving. Not a death, not a divorce, but a fading closeness you never thought you'd lose. You grieve the conversations that used to last hours, the laughter around the dinner table, the simple joy of being needed, not just tolerated. And what makes it harder is that the world doesn't talk about this. There are no words for being emotionally sidelined by your own child. It's too quiet, too invisible, so you carry it alone. And it seeps into your mornings, your sleep, your smile. But let me say this clearly, it is not your fault. You were not too much. You were not too emotional. You were not too old-fashioned. You were a parent, a provider, a listener, a teacher, a comfort. You poured decades of your life into someone, and it's okay to feel the ache when that pouring no longer feels reciprocated. This doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. It makes you human. And the pain you feel now, it's not proof of failure. It's proof of how deeply you've loved. So if they don't call, you're still valuable. If they don't see you, you're still radiant. If they don't appreciate your presence, you still belong. You are allowed to feel this pain. You are allowed to name it, and you are allowed to begin healing, not because they change, but because you decide you're worth that healing. Because here's the quiet truth most elders aren't told. Even if your children forget your worth, you don't have to. Even if they walk away, you can stand taller. Even if they stop reaching out, you can reach inward and find someone who never left, you. And that is where the healing begins. Section 2. Reclaiming your inner value. When the people you love treat you like you don't matter, the first instinct is to question yourself. We internalize their distance. We mistake their silence for a reflection of our worth. But here's the truth. Your value is not something others get to decide. The way your children treat you may hurt deeply, but it does not define you. Their forgetfulness, their impatience, their failure to see your heart, none of it erases the decades of strength, love, wisdom, and sacrifice you've lived through. So what does it look like to reclaim your inner value after 60? especially when the people who once clung to your every word now barely hear your voice. Step one, stop seeking validation where it's no longer offered. This is one of the hardest truths to face. When someone you love starts treating you like a background character in their life, the natural instinct is to try harder. You call more often, you make more effort, you overlook more hurt. But here's what no one tells you: chasing love doesn't deepen it, it depletes you. So the first act of reclaiming your value is no longer watering relationships that don't water you back. You're not being mean, you're being honest. You're not giving up on them, you're coming back to yourself. You are allowed to stop overgiving. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to say, if you want to be close to me, it has to be mutual. Because you deserve a love that comes toward you, not just a love that takes from you. Step two, reconnect with the version of you outside of parent. After decades of parenting, it's easy to forget you are not just a parent. You are a whole person. You had dreams before your children arrived. You had hobbies, beliefs, friendships, talents, many of which were pushed aside in the name of family. But now you get to revisit those parts of yourself. You get to ask, what have I missed about myself? What brings me peace now, even when I'm alone? What parts of me have been waiting quietly to be seen again? This isn't about ignoring your children. It's about expanding beyond them. It's about realizing that your identity was never meant to stop at motherhood, fatherhood, or grandparenthood. You are more than who you are to others. You are who you are to yourself. And that relationship, the one with your own soul, might be the one most in need of mending. Step three, create a life that reflects your value. When you feel invisible, the temptation is to shrink, to stop showing up, to assume no one wants to hear from you. But now is the time to do the opposite. Join a walking group or class in your community. Volunteer for a cause that feels meaningful. Call a friend who always makes you laugh. Write down your memories, your stories, your truths. Create a rhythm of daily life that reminds you, I still have purpose. You do. You have a lifetime of wisdom inside you. And someone out there, even if it's a stranger, a neighbor, or a new friend, needs exactly what you carry. You are not waiting to be invited. You are already worthy of being seen. So dress up for no reason. Sing while you cook. Smile at the mirror, because the child in you is still alive and the elder in you is just beginning to bloom. You don't need their validation to feel valuable. You need your own recognition. You are allowed to say, I still matter, even if no one says it out loud. I still have love to give, and it will not be wasted. I still belong here, not as a helper, not as a parent, but as a whole human being. And every time you speak kindly to yourself, you reclaim a little more of the dignity no one can take away. You are not waiting to be chosen, you are choosing yourself. And that choice, that is healing, that is strength, that is freedom. Section 3, healing without their apology. One of the hardest lessons you may ever face is this: you don't need their apology to begin your healing. Yes, it would be beautiful to hear, I'm sorry I've been distant. I didn't realize how much I hurt you. I miss you and want to rebuild what we've lost. But the truth is, that apology may never come. Not because you don't deserve it, but because some people aren't ready to see what they've done. And you, dear soul, cannot keep waiting for someone else's awareness to set you free. Why waiting for closure keeps you stuck. We're taught that healing needs closure, that to move on, someone else must admit they were wrong. But healing is not permission. Healing is not a reward someone gives you. Healing is a decision you make for your own peace. Every day you spend waiting for their I'm sorry is a day you delay your own return to wholeness. You carry the wound, but you also carry the power to tend to it. And yes, it hurts to realize they don't see it, but your healing doesn't require their seeing. It requires your choosing. Step 1, grieve what you wish had been sometimes. We can't move forward because we're grieving a version of the relationship that never existed. You may have wished they'd check on you more, they'd ask for your stories, they'd include you in decisions, dinners, holidays. It's okay to mourn what never came to be. It's okay to cry for the closeness you hope to feel. That grief is not weakness, it's love with nowhere to land. So name the loss, write it out, speak it aloud. Because when you give sorrow a voice, you free it from turning into bitterness. Step 2, honor your own truth. There's a part of healing that comes from saying, what happened to me matters, even if no one else talks about it. You don't need others to agree with your pain for it to be real. You don't need validation to be allowed to feel. And when you honor your truth, something inside you softens. You stop second guessing your memories. You stop gaslighting your own experiences. You begin to live from a place of self respect, not self blame. Step 3, build a life that doesn't depend on their change. This may be the most empowering and most difficult truth. They may never change, but you still can. You can still laugh. You can still find community. You can still feel joy. You can still be deeply loved, even if it's not by them. Create rituals that affirm your worth. Light a candle each morning and say, I deserve peace. Cook a meal you love, even if it's just for you. Walk in nature and let the trees witness your healing. And if you're open to it, build new circles. It's never too late to find chosen family, a neighbor, a community center, a support group, a kind stranger who becomes a friend, because love didn't leave you. It simply may return through a different door. If you've been waiting for someone to say sorry, let me say this to you now. I'm sorry they didn't call. I'm sorry they didn't see your tears. I'm sorry they left you wondering what you did wrong. But most of all, I'm proud of you for surviving the silence, for holding your dignity, for waking up each day and choosing to stay kind in a world that didn't always return the favor. You don't need their words to know your worth. You don't need their change to choose your peace. You can heal without the apology, because healing was never for them. It was always, beautifully, bravely, for you. If this video found its way to you today, I hope you remember this. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are not a burden. You are a soul with a lifetime of wisdom, love, and courage. You are still becoming, even now. And just because someone else can't see your light doesn't mean it stops shining. Yes, it hurts when those you love turn away, but that does not make you any less worthy of being cherished. Let this be your turning point. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of love for yourself. You get to choose peace. You get to protect your heart. You get to stop waiting for someone else's permission to feel whole. So let today be the day you return home to yourself. Speak kindly to the mirror. Take yourself on a walk. Write your story down. Let yourself laugh again. Let yourself rest. Let yourself be. Because your life is not over. Your joy is not done. And your love, your deep, patient, unwavering love, is still one of the most powerful things in this world. If this message touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video so others can find it too. Share your story in the comments. Your voice may be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Subscribe to True Senior Wisdom for more reflections, healing conversations, and guidance for this sacred chapter of life. Because here, you are not alone. Here, your story is honored. And here, your wisdom still matters deeply.